Good evening. My name is Susan Pond. I'm honoured to chair this meeting as President of the Royal Society of New South Wales. This meeting is being held online and recorded so that viewers can watch it later on the Society's YouTube channel. Welcome to you one and all. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which each of us is living, working and learning. I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. I note that it is National NAIDOC Week, during which events are being held across Australia to celebrate and recognise the history, culture and achievements of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The Royal Society in New South Wales is entering its third century as a learned organisation dedicated to knowledge in all its dimensions, spanning the sciences and humanities. The Society endures while other organisations have come and gone because of the purity of its mission, which is to provide independent, authentic, multidisciplinary and forward-thinking public discourse and debate on matters of importance to humanity. Tonight's panel is a fine example of the Society accomplishing this mission. Its aim is to help people understand the intent of the forthcoming referendum on a First Nations voice to Parliament that is protected by the Constitution. Changing the Constitution in Australia is a rare event, the most recent referendum being held in 1999. It is important to ensure that the electorate is well informed, particularly given that this year's referendum will be the first for voters under the age of 42. We have 4 expert speakers tonight to tell us what we need to know about the voice before we vote. 3 of the speakers will be introduced by the convener of the panel, Emeritus Professor Peter Baume AC. I am delighted to introduce Peter as the first speaker. Peter is a distinguished fellow of the Society, a retired Australian doctor and politician. He was a senator for New South Wales from 1974 to 1991, representing the Liberal Party. He served as Minister for Aboriginal Affairs from 1980 to 1982 and Minister for Education from 1982 to 1983. Peter, I'm delighted to hand over to you to begin the discussion.
Thank you very much, Susan. So first of all, welcome everybody. One of the questions we want to answer tonight is how should we as individuals vote in the referendum, which is coming up for a vote in, say, October. And we want tonight's webinar to help us decide that question. We often acknowledge country and have welcomes to country, but Megan Davis has observed in writing that such events do not change the law. Not only that, but the country we acknowledge and are welcome to was taken bloodily. It wasn't given to us. If we set out to design a system to give us marked Aboriginal disadvantage on all health counts, if we set out to design a system which gave us incarceration rates of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, which are awful, if we set out to design a system which gave us Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander deaths in custody, which are shocking, if we set out to design a system which gave us school attendances which are poor, if that is what we designed, then we did it very well. For we've succeeded in entrenching all those forms of disadvantage. We oversee a system which doesn't work, which is not producing results. There is a shameful gap between Indigenous and other Australians on all counts. And our efforts to close that gap have been spectacularly unsuccessful. And with one exception. And the exception is that in the education area, what has been said is true, but the iceberg is slowly coming out of the water. And there are some Aboriginals with very fine educational qualifications. Now, perhaps we need to clean up all those matters before we lecture other nations on how they should treat oppressed minorities. Professor Megan Davis wrote in a recent quarterly essay, there it is, she wrote, "How do democracies move on from frontier massacres and forced racial segregation and the many manifestations of protection legislation?" And she went on. That's another way of stating the question before us tonight. How did we do better than we have? But did you know that in 1973, the Whitlam government appointed Elizabeth Ann Reid to advise it on the effects of every proposed law on women? Every law. That's what she did. She advised the government on the effects of women on every law. When she did that, the sky didn't fall in. There were no High Court challenges. There were no adverse consequences. Cabinet received her advice, but then made its own decisions. And what was done then was for systemic disadvantage for women who required affirmative action, just as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people require affirmative action today. So we should get tonight, as well as information about this referendum, a greater appreciation of referenda generally. So that comes as well as information about this particular referendum. Now, each one of us has a vote, and each one of us has probably already thought a lot about what is proposed and what we might do. Many of us have already decided how we'll vote, but many of us are confused, and we're confused by different assertions and different opinions, and we're confused about what we might choose to do. The people in this society are intelligent and thoughtful and well-educated, yet many of us are confused. We're confused about the referendum coming up. And we want to know a lot of things. We want to know, for example, if the Constitution can be changed as times change and new challenges emerge. We want to know, is it true that only bipartisan support leads to referendum success? We want to understand the no case, why Peter Dutton has said what he has said, or what he has not said. We want to know why the proponents of this referendum are running a community-based and politician-free campaign. But let us be clear, the model we use now doesn't work. We need something quite different. This referendum gives us a chance to take one step towards a better model. So there are lots of things we want to know. We have 3 eminently qualified speakers to help us. They're Dean Ashenden, Chris Puplick, and Megan Davis. So let's start with Megan Davis. She's a professor of law, of constitutional law. She has a doctorate from ANU, which is a fine university. She has advised many governments on many things. She helped prepare and read the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And she's Pro-Vice-Chancellor at the University of New South Wales, which is another fine university. And her CV in Who's Who is very extensive and very impressive. Some of the audience might like to read her quarterly essay recently entitled Voice of Reason on Recognition and Renewal. So without further ado, let's invite Professor Davis to address us.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for that kind introduction. And I was trying to look for my quarterly essay, and I plugged my quarterly essay, which I've just written. The purpose of the essay being to try and articulate why it is that a voice to Parliament was chosen by the First Nations people who participated in the dialogue process, but also what it is and why it might make a practical difference. I've got about 10 minutes. I've got my timer on. I just wanted to say from the outset, happy NAIDOC week, of course. But I think it's interesting in Peter's introduction where he said, I've advised many governments. One that I haven't was the Morrison government. So he refused to meet with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on this matter, which was quite unusual because we had all met with John Howard and all the subsequent prime ministers from Gillard to Rudd to Abbott to Turnbull. He, as Australians discovered after the election, had a rather unorthodox approach to governing and liberal democracy. Even under John Howard, there was an open door for Aboriginal people to drive down to Parliament House and meet with the Prime Minister and ministers, but that did not happen during the Morrison era, and I wanted to make that point from the outset. And I wanted to also acknowledge Peter's point, which I think is a really important point that's missed in the way in which this debate has been shaped, that the system is not working now. The status quo does not work. And that conversation is completely absent from the way in which the debate is being prosecuted, particularly when you have people such as the opposition leader and Little Proud stand up and talk about the voice and why it won't work and why it's not necessary, when actually their 8 years of governance is what has really driven the exigency of the voice. And I think that's a really important point, because there's a lot of policy settings that were introduced from Abbott onwards that actually disenfranchised Aboriginal communities and the Aboriginal voice. And I think it's a really key to understand the voice and why it was so prevalent in 2017. You need to understand some of those policy settings, including the Indigenous Advancement Strategy, and the reports by the Australian National Audit Office into why they violated so many Commonwealth rules around the handling of billions of dollars of taxpayer money, and how so few First Nations people were consulted in the development of that policy. And I think that's a very important point to make from the outset when we're thinking about voice, and we're thinking about the skills and the knowledge that the opposition has to assess this voice. Because in my view, they don't have the runs on the board to understand why the voice is needed, because they don't know what the problem is. So I'm 3 minutes in, and I'll do a kind of potted history of Uluru and talk about the referendum and the voice. We're probably in our 12th year, I think, of constitutional recognition. Some people take Howard and his commitment to a referendum on recognition 4 days out of the kind of 2007 election as the starting point of recognition. Others point to the Republic referendum, where you had party support for that singular line in the preamble that failed for recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture. And from the 99 referendum onwards, you had this kind of multi-party support for this notion of recognition. We take it kind of from Gillard with the hung parliament and the negotiation of the Greens and the independents, Robert Oakeshott and Tony Windsor, who pushed Gillard in that letter of agreement to move on this multi-party support for recognition. So they said, as a part of you having power in the lower house to govern the nation, you need to move on this matter. And that's why Gillard set up the expert panel on the recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the Constitution. And so since that point in 2011, we've had 7 different processes, all supervised by the state, by the Commonwealth, and 10 reports. And that doesn't include the most recent parliamentary inquiry, but that's a lot of public policy in plain sight. So none of this was hidden; it was all public, and that's a lot of work on constitutional recognition, both in relation to any policy matter relating to Indigenous peoples in Australia, but any policy matter really. And certainly, if we look comparatively around the world, 12 years is a lot of intensive work towards getting to the ballot box on constitutional recognition. It's fair to say that in that process, in the early days, there was a failure to consult communities on what that form of recognition might look like. It's important to note from the outset, because again, this creates confusion in the Australian community, that constitutional recognition does not mean acknowledgement. It does not mean its dictionary meaning. And so that's been one of the pieces of public confusion since actually 2011. Recognition in the dictionary does mean acknowledgement, but in a legal and political sense, it doesn't. And in relation to Indigenous peoples, constitutional recognition and the notion of recognition sits on a spectrum of reform. And at one end of the spectrum is a weak form of recognition, and at the other end is a strong form of recognition. And so the weak end of recognition is actually something like the dictionary meaning. It is an acknowledgement in a kind of something that we call a statement of fact. So you're stating that Aboriginal people were here prior to the arrivals, that they're still here, and that their culture has been maintained, and possibly some flowery words about their relationship to land. Noel Pearson refers to that form of recognition as a plaque in the Constitution. So it's a kind of written recognition. It's regarded as weak in a political and legal sense because it's weak in the sense that it doesn't do anything. So it doesn't compel the state to act. It doesn't prohibit the state from doing something, and nor does it empower anyone to do anything. So it doesn't empower Indigenous peoples. And there's virtually no evidence in the world that any form of symbolic recognition of Indigenous peoples in the Constitution leads to change. And that's a really important point. There's some very spurious but poorly executed arguments that acknowledgement in some parts of the world have led to reduced suicide rates, but there's actually that piece of research is very old and really not related to constitutional recognition. So that's an important point, because when we did consultations with Australians in 2011, and we did a very comprehensive exercise in consulting Australians at every jurisdiction, and in addition to polling through, I think it was Crosby Techstar, but in the face-to-face, what we heard from so many Australians was precisely what Aboriginal people were saying, which was symbolic recognition that doesn't actually elicit any change is a waste of time in terms of a referendum. At the time that we did that work in 2011, it was around the beginning of closing the gap. We were in the mining boom, and Australians were saying, if you do something tokenistic that doesn't actually produce change, it's not worth doing. So that unity ticket exists to this day, even with the research that we're saying now, today. We had focus groups in the field in regional Australia last week. It's still a unity ticket with Aboriginal people. If you're going to do the change, it must make a change on the ground. At the strong end of this kind of spectrum of reform is something that might compel the state to do something, or stop the state from doing something, or prohibit the state from doing something, or empower First Nations peoples to do something. So recognition sits on a spectrum. That is how it works. And in the dialogues that we ran under Turnbull's Referendum Council, we got permission from Bill Shorten and Turnbull to run a series of dialogues based on a number of options that sit on the spectrum. And they included the Gillard options, which included minimalist or symbolic forms of recognition, such as Section 25, which Murray Gleeson used to say, why would you waste your opportunity of recognition on deleting something that has no operative impact? It is a defunct provision in the Constitution. Why would you waste your time on that and not do something that actually has a substantive impact? And so the two leaders signed off on those reforms, and that included something like a voice, constitutional voice, and treaty making. So agreement making we had to take out, because out to the communities as well, because there was a process in South Australia, which ceased not long after there was a change of the Labor government to a Liberal government, and there was a process underway in Victoria. So that's what the spectrum means, and that's how Indigenous peoples view recognition, as being many things, but the issue is, how do you settle on one thing? And so surprisingly to many people, post the Uluru Dialogues, First Nations people decided on an enhanced role in participating in the democratic decision-making of the Australian state. They didn't go for treaty, and they didn't go for a non-discrimination clause in the Constitution either. They also didn't go for the amendment of or deletion and replacement of the racist power. It was the voice to Parliament and the idea that you could have a mechanism in which you could participate and give input into laws and policies that impacted communities, that was of more interest to communities than anything else. I wanted to make one more point about the Uluru Dialogues. One of the reasons they were set up, and Abbott committed to them, and Turnbull was the one that ran them, or at least continued that commitment, was that there was massive backlash in the Aboriginal community to the Recognise campaign, and to the idea that there was political consensus coalescing around the idea that symbolism was going to be the form of recognition. So when you talk preamble to our people, they are completely and utterly turned off constitutional recognition, because they see it as a plaque. They see it a bit like welcomes and acknowledgements, but it doesn't empower our people to make any change on the ground. And so part of that backlash from the Recognise campaign, which did see you know, neon R's on airplanes and all of that kind of stuff that happened with that campaign, was that we went to Abbott, me, Noel Pearson, Patrick Dodson and Kirsty Parker, and we said to him, you cannot run a constitutional referendum on this option, which virtually 99% of the Aboriginal community agreed was not what we wanted. You need to run a process that allows us to get some clear air and ask people what they want. And that's the substance of the dialogues. It was designed in a way to prevent groupthink, because we were kind of on the back end of native title meetings where the loudest person in the room, the activist that wants what they want, comes into a room, dominates, and then ends up with what they want because not everybody else is too intimidated to talk. So it was a very importantly structured dialogue process that allowed women to participate and people who are introverted or shy or don't normally talk to participate. But the important part of that was to break that kind of groupthink. So it wasn't set pieces, people just saying treaty, rah, rah, but it was a 3-day process with civics education, legal education, the options, and plenty of time for people to discuss and debate based on what is the Australian legal and political temperament for change, what reform might look like. And at the end of the day, people selected the voice to Parliament. I can talk about in question time why that was selected and what policy in particular I think influenced that, that reform. But I'll quickly kind of wrap up because I can see I'm on 14 minutes and stealing everybody else's time. The choice was for a voice, not agreement making. So for 6 years, we've been working out of the UNSW, the Indigenous Law Centre, on the smell of an oily rag, just travelling around the country for 6 years, talking to people about the reform, what happened at Uluru, and what a voice is. From day one, post Uluru, we always knew that we would come up against the issue, because all liberal democracies do, about the decision to defer detail. How much detail do you defer before you have a constitutional referendum, where actually what you do with constitutions is you're asking people to vote on a principle. You're not asking them to vote on the bricks and mortar. The bricks and mortar is for the Parliament. That is the Parliament's job. And as we know in the debate this year, the deferral debate has been one that has been confusing to Australians, and I can talk more about it at the question time. There is detail on the voice, but you cannot have a fully fledged bill to get a successful referendum, because it will be far too much information for you to be able to have a referendum. The deferral spectrum means you can either have too little or too much, but where the sweet spot is in terms of detail is complex for all liberal democracies when they choose to amend their constitution. The last point I'll make, and then I'll leave everything to question time, is it's an unusual debate. What we hear from pollsters and lobbyists and professional politicians is that they expected the Trumpian misinformation avalanche to come with the Albo election. It didn't come then, but it's come with this referendum. And it's problematic for the future federal election and any future referendums. The things that are the no case, and there's 4 of them funded by the one kind of entity, are able to say, and the mainstream media project that as kind of passive conduit to misinformation and disinformation, is quite troubling. And we're too reliant on fact checks from RMIT and others to be able to keep afloat of some of the things that are being said, including that one spectacular example is that the Lint Cafe siege could not have been brought to an end because the special ops from the New South Wales Police would have had ring the voice to consult them on how to end the siege. They're the kinds of things that are circulating on Facebook, which is really where the referendum is playing out. What we see is the no case using Parliament, Senate debates, House of Rep debates, and media headlines to produce really effective Facebook campaigns that are geo-targeted to the electorates that they want to influence. That's fine, that's how politics runs. But the lack of the misinformation and disinformation, the lack of facts is really problematic when we want Australians to vote in an informed way. We don't want media to be a cheerleader for yes. We just want Australians to have factual information that allows them to go to the ballot box and vote in an informed way. And at the 5th of July, 2023, we are not there yet in relation to that, which many didn't expect. So I'm going to stop because I've actually taken 20 minutes. So I'm really apologetic about that. And I'll hand it over, Peter, Susan, with my profuse apologies for taking up so much time.
Megan, it was very nice. We're going to change direction a little bit. I'm going to invite Dean Ashenden to speak. Now, Dean has worked as an academic, as a political advisor, and in journalism. He was actually presenter of Radio National's program, Education Issues. His book, Telling Tennant's Story, The Strange Career of the Great Australian Silence. By the way, Tennant refers to Tennant Creek, not house tenants. It was the inaugural winner of the Australian Political Book of the Year Award. So, Dean, would you please address us?
Peter, thank you for the invitation and the introduction. Peter has asked if I could provide a bit of a historical background to constitutional referendums in general and to the current one and the 1967 referendum in particular. I must say, talking about constitutional change, where Megan, as a member of the panel, makes me a little bit bashful. Megan, I hope you'll correct me if and as required. The constitutional change has a relatively low bar. It requires a majority of voters in a majority of states and a majority overall. Despite that not very high bar, referenda have a very bad record. I think the total is something like 8 yes out of a total of 44 proposals. Why that might be has been a matter of much speculation. It may just be that often proposals are hard to understand, or the people don't care about them, and under those circumstances voting no is easier than voting yes. For whatever reason, the huge standout in that long history is the referendum of 1967, when just over 90% of voters were in favour of the proposal, which was effectively to restore or to put Aboriginal Australians, the term was the Aboriginal race, into the Constitution, and to that extent achieve a certain kind of parity with other Australians. So that was remarkable in the context of that history. It was also remarkable as a decisive break with a long history of quite unabashed Australian racism. I think it came in the wake of the revelations about the horrors of fascism and the beginnings of a worldwide anti-imperial movement, which in Australia surfaced in the idea that equality between people and peoples was a common sense accepted by almost all, And also the way to achieve equality in Australia was through what was called assimilation. Its origins lie with the anthropologists of the 1930s, but it was carried from minority to majority under the leadership of Paul Hasluck, who was a long-serving Minister for Territories in Menzies governments. Assimilation began as a minority position, but ended as an overwhelmingly majority one by the late 60s. And I think that the referendum result reflected an almost universal consensus that assimilation was the way forward. But as that vote was carried, the consensus around assimilation was collapsing, and it collapsed very rapidly. So in the 2 or 3 years that followed, there were divisions between within the white political Australia about whether to go with assimilation or what was called self-determination. The Labor Party split from its former agreement with the coalition. There was a split within the coalition essentially between the Country Party and the Liberal Party, the Country Party being now the Nationals, and then within the Liberal Party between the Liberals and the Conservative Liberals. And over the half a century since then, the alignments that formed in the wake of the collapse of assimilation have really persisted with remarkably little change. So that, and the result of that absence of consensus is that on one issue after another, land rights, treaty, stolen children, compensation and reparations, on national symbols and celebrations and memorials, on all of those things, what we've really seen is promises made and then withdrawn, hopes dashed, concessions made and withdrawn, and cheese-paring compromises. All of that has been achieved at the cost of a huge amount of political effort, to which the Voice proposal is no exception, as Megan mentioned. And by the way, I could highly recommend that her quarterly essay. It's a terrific piece of polemic analysis and history. I think if the yes vote is successful in the present constitution, we can probably hope that the political alignments that have persisted for 50 odd years are beginning to break down, and that in the wake of that, a consensus will be formed, but this time under a relatively strong form of constitutional recognition. If, on the other hand, the no vote prevails, then I think that those alignments and all the division and frustrating lack of progress are likely to be renewed. So to say that it matters is an understatement, and it matters not just to the people who would be most affected by it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean. We're finally going to turn to Chris Puplick. He was a senator for New South Wales. His political opponents were actually scared when he got up to speak. He was also Privacy Commissioner in this state, and he has the AM. So can we have Chris Puplick's presentation?
Good evening, everybody. My name is Chris Puplick, and I come to this conversation with a little experience in a couple of areas. Firstly, as a senator for New South Wales for a number of years, and secondly, because I started my commitment in public life working on the staff of William Charles Wentworth when he was the very first Commonwealth Minister for Aboriginal Affairs. And so I've been associated with matters relating to First Nations issues in the Australian public life for a number of years. I've been asked to say a little about this forthcoming referendum, which will be held presumably sometime in October, and which proposes a change to the Australian Constitution to add a new chapter to it. And I'm just going to step back very briefly and say something about that document, the Australian Constitution. It's an important document about which almost all Australians are profoundly unaware or ignorant, but it is the foundation document of our federal polity, and it is a document which sets the rules by which we are governed at the federal level. The introduction to the Constitution, in fact, refers to the fact that the states, and I quote, have agreed to unite in one indissoluble federal commonwealth. Two things are important there: principle of federalism and the role of the states. And so what in fact happened was that in 1901, we adopted a constitution. And that document, which is, as I say, largely unknown and not full of high-flown rhetoric like the American Constitution, is divided into a number of chapters. And it may not seem important, but it has some relevance. The Chapter 1 of the Constitution deals with the Parliament, Chapter 2 with the executive government, Chapter 3 with the judiciary, that's the High Court, Chapter 5 with the states, and Chapter 8 with the way in which the Constitution may be amended. Now, the Constitution may be amended by a vote of the people. It's very difficult to do that. And in fact, of the 44 attempts that have been made to amend the Constitution, only 8 of them have succeeded. And we don't have time to go into the details there. But let's simply say that what happens is that a bill is passed through the Parliament. It has to be passed by an absolute majority of both houses of the Parliament. It then has to be submitted to the people for their approval, not less than 2 and not more than 6 months after its passage. So we're thinking probably October now. In order to succeed, it has to obtain a majority of the people of Australia and a majority of the states. Now, a majority of the people of Australia includes the representatives of the Australian Capital Territory and the Northern Territory, but they are not counted for the purpose of the states. So to have a majority of the states means that the referendum has to succeed in 4 out of the 6 states. Now, at the moment, there are approximately 17.3 million people on the Commonwealth electoral roll. Not all of them will vote, obviously, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, that they did. That means that in order to get a majority of the people, there must be something like 8,600,000 votes in favour of the proposition. But if a majority of people in the states of Tasmania, South Australia and Western Australia vote no, and that could be done by a vote of 1,700,000 people voting no, then in fact the referendum would fail. So in other words, the barrier is much higher for the yes case. They must get at least 8.6 million votes, whereas the no case can succeed if it got as little as 1.7 million votes. Now, what's been said in the debate, of course, is that the details of the referendum are unclear. We know that there is to be a voice to the Parliament, and the constitutional amendment proposes a new Chapter 9 to the Constitution. In recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the first people of Australia, 1, there shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. 2, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice may make representations to the Parliament and the Executive Government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And 3, the Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, including its composition, functions, powers and procedures. Now, the question has been raised, does this mean, for example, that having a new chapter of the Constitution, Chapter 9, gives the voice the same status as the other institutions established by chapters of the Constitution, such as the executive government, the Parliament, or the High Court? That's an open question. The second thing that arises is that the voice, although it is to be permanent, its composition may be changed at any time by any federal government by simple piece of legislation in both houses of the Parliament. We are being asked to vote for the voice as a matter of principle, and increasingly proponents of the voice are now talking about this in terms of not so much the details as the principle of recognition of First Nations people in the Constitution. And interestingly, of course, that is something that is supported by all sides in this debate, including those who are opposed to the voice. Now, the issues that have been raised about the voice are worth examining. For example, the voice has now been given, or should be given under this amendment, the right to make representations to the executive government. Now, representations to ministers, particularly if they are for the purposes of cabinet deliberations, are exempt from the Freedom of Information Act. So while the voice indications to the Parliament would be public, there's no certainty that the representations made by the voice to the executive government will in fact not be exempt documents and never in fact made public. The second matter that arises is exactly how is the voice to be constituted. The Calmer-Langdon report that many of you will be familiar with proposes some 35 regionally elected delegates, but we have no idea. The government has not committed to that model or indeed to any other model. So we don't know how the Parliament will be, how the voice will be elected. Thirdly, we have no idea exactly who will be electors. For example, there is still some legal confusion over the question about who constitutes an Aboriginal person in Australia. The cases of Love and Toms have demonstrated that a person can be an Aboriginal Australian without being a citizen. The case of Montgomery has demonstrated that one can be recognised as an Aboriginal person without actually having any Aboriginal heritage. Mr. Montgomery was a New Zealander, in fact, with no Aboriginal heritage. There's the question, will there be a separate Aboriginal roll? And what does that have to say when for the first time we keep a roll based on race, as indeed it would be? And would that roll be accessible? The Commonwealth electoral roll is not an accessible document. Would the First Nations or the voice roll be an accessible document? And then we come to the question of exactly what happens in terms of the powers and definition, and what role would the High Court possibly play in this? Clearly, the High Court would play a role if there were disputes about the election system, because the High Court is the Court of Disputed Returns for the Commonwealth Electoral Act, and I'm presuming that people will be elected under the Commonwealth Electoral Act. And finally, I draw attention to a very unknown part of the Australian Constitution, Section 101. It provides, and I'll quote it exactly, "There shall be an interstate commission with such powers of adjudication and administration as the Parliament deems necessary for the execution and maintenance within the Commonwealth of the provisions of this Constitution relating to trade and commerce and of all laws made thereunder." So in other words, there in the Constitution, there shall be an interstate commission. There isn't an interstate commission. The High Court scrubbed it out in effect. And so there are questions about what in fact may be the ultimate status of the voice. Now, of course, all of these matters are matters that will be in the hands of the Commonwealth Parliament to determine. They may be changed over time, because the Parliament will have the right to do that under the Constitution. And in the meantime, the Australian people are being provided with information in the form of a pamphlet canvassing the yes and no case, and they will have to make that decision. It's a profound decision for us to make, and I hope that the debate around it will be civilised, intelligent and informative, and that we will all have the opportunity to make a decision going forward of great importance to the nation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Chris. We've got some questions in the Q&A box, but before we turn to those questions, there are some that we might ask. First of all, Megan Davis, do you want to rebut any of the points made by Christopher?
Hi. Yeah, probably 80% of them. I don't probably have time to do that now, or we'll be here for hours. I think in his presentation, he has over-egged a number of things, not the least being the implication of the decision in Love and Toms and Montgomery. The fact that Langton Kalma has never been the model for the voice. It was the model for a non-constitutional voice set up by Morrison and Wyatt with terms of reference that said they must not contemplate a constitutional voice or the Uluru Statement from the Heart. That's a huge bit of misinformation and disinformation that continues to circulate despite our efforts to stop it, which is why Albanese doesn't refer to it. He referred to the positions, he referred to a lot of uncertainty about what the voice would look like, including the implications of having these positions elected on the basis of race. Race is a social construct, and that is not what the voice is being created on the basis of. It's being created on the basis of the cultural uniqueness of First Nations peoples. That position having been recognised through the common law in the High Court's decision in Mabo, and the subsequent legislation that recognises the cultural distinctiveness of First Nations people. I think his comment on the High Court is also exaggerated. One of the really important things about understanding the voice to Parliament and what it will be, and people's and the kind of, I think Brett Walker said it's too silly for words, the kinds of scenarios people have put up, is that at the end of the day, nobody can stop an Australian from taking tinfoil arguments to the High Court, because our country and our democracy is distinguished by very good courts, an independent judiciary and a rule of law. And this point has been made on multiple occasions by many former judges of the High Court, including Ken Hayne, who has written on this, and Bob French. Nobody said to people taking cases to the High Court during the COVID lockdown, well, you should be prevented from doing that because it's nonsensical what you're arguing. The reality is that people will try, but it's very clear that the High Court, those kinds of actions won't succeed. But it's a bit far-fetched to say to just one group of society, you're not entitled to take a case as a litigant to the High Court on the basis of whatever far-fetched argument it may be, or not. But I don't recall people making such claims in relation to the High Court during the COVID lockdown, when there were quite ridiculous arguments about why the Commonwealth and the states couldn't regulate during that period. I could go on, but I don't think it's appropriate for me to take up all of the time to respond.
Megan, there's another question you might answer. Why have some very prominent Aboriginal people said they want something else?
So there are some Aboriginal people who argue for some other things. And some of them are Senator Thorpe, Michael Mansell. These are some of the very small number of people who attended all the dialogues, but walked out at Uluru when they didn't get their own way. So people often talk about those leaders, but they don't talk about the 200 who stayed in the room. And so there are some, and we're firmly comfortable that the majority of our people support it. Reconciliation Australia's barometer last year showed 88% of our people supported. Our Ipsos poll on the eve of the 26th of January this year showed 83%. And our very substantive YouGov MRP poll shows it sits around 83, 82% of our people who supported. And that was the largest sample ever. I think that what we see in campaigns, and particularly this one, is that negative sells news. We know how the news works. And so what you see is the elevation of not just the Trumpian misinformation that I think Linda alluded to today, but you see the elevation of no positions from people like the sovereignty mob who are claiming secession and other things to the same level as the Yes campaign. There's nothing really that we can do to mitigate the impact of the way the media does its work. But I think it's overstated to think that these leaders represent the majority of First Nations people's voices, because they don't.
There's one other question. Professor Anne Toomey has said that the change proposed will only affect Commonwealth laws, the Commonwealth. And she said it won't affect state laws. And then, is this correct? And does it mean that a rogue state could pass contrary laws?
So, I mean, a rogue state could pass contrary laws in terms of a particular thing that the state has done as a consequence of a voice representation, for example. I mean, that it's a federal system. While it's true that that is the case, a state government could do that, the Commonwealth still has capacity within its power to override or disallow a particular provision at a state level if it so chooses. It's done that before. It could again. One of the limitations or the weaknesses of the arguments for treaty in this country is that it's done at a state level, and there's and territory level, and there's 3 provisions in the Australian Constitution that could lead to the override of those treaty provisions, given that those treaties will now just be ordinary acts of state parliaments. So it probably is the case that might happen. These kinds of things really rely on what the scenario is and what the politics are at the time in terms of what the response would be in terms of that. But certainly I would argue that a constitutional voice that is mandated by the Australian people at a referendum would actually enhance the culture in this country of listening to First Nations peoples at the very point of policy and law genesis, or the genesis of laws and policies. What we're trying to create is a culture of consultation early on. So this would not be a voice, in our view, that is having to run around while the bells are ringing and trying influencing at that point. I would expect there to be a cascading effect of the federal voice across the Federation. And I'd have to say, or I can share, Peter, that straight after Uluru, multiple states and territories reached out to us about what their governments can do, or their states can do, and their territories can do to render their departments and their governments ready for a federal voice, and how that would fit in with the system. I would think it brings a lot of coherency and more coordination to the work of the states, given the way in which, as you know, Aboriginal Affairs cuts across the Commonwealth and then the states and territories in relation to their responsibilities under the Australian Constitution, not the least being the Close the Gap framework. So I would see this as more positive, but that's certainly not a foolproof in terms of a rogue state And in a liberal democracy like ours, and in our federal system, that would have to play out in the normal course of Australian democracy as to how that is resolved.
There's one final question. The polls we have to date seem to be trending downwards. What does that mean?
So the polls were always very, very high. So they've been up around 60 to 70% for 6 years. We always knew at some point there would be some kind of correction. What we found, though, was that the kind of acceleration of the decline came with Dutton saying no. So the LNP saying no had a huge effect on that, because what's happened is Australians are now voting along party lines. And that's what you're seeing playing out. And then the second point being, again, the disinformation, misinformation point, that it's been quite striking to see the debate deteriorate on the basis of what actually isn't fact. And there's multiple examples of that. And so, you know, up until now, I don't think the Yes campaign has been very effective at pushing back on that disinformation and misinformation. So that is absolutely a key driver of the decline. But also the settling of the debate around detail. It's not to exonerate the Yes campaign of not being, of not effectively executing that. It's a strange referendum in that the Commonwealth is kind of, the federal government is running it, but it also exonerates itself of any responsibility for the campaigning of it. And so there's a lot of work for the Yes side in relation to that. I think Linda Burney did a very good job today in relation to the detail about what the voice is. But I'd say, Peter, our work is, we're not Yes 23, so we didn't go out with a big yes. We waited till the bill was passed. We are the Aboriginal leadership who did Uluru and the dialogues. And right now, for the past probably 3 to 4 months, we've been out in the field running dialogues face-to-face with Aussies. So we've been doing it in Far North Queensland, Southeast Queensland, Central Queensland, and most of regional New South Wales as of now. And having, you know, running dialogues with them. So they're structured 2-hour conversations. And we are seeing a lot of input from Australians that they're not getting the information that we are providing to them. We don't have any Yes paraphernalia in the room because we don't want Australians to feel cajoled. We just want them to get the information regarding why we issued it to them and not the Australian people. Sorry, not the politicians. Why we decided to ask them to walk with us in terms of the Uluru Statement, what's behind the voice, what is the amendment, and what's the referendum, and all of the fundamental civics that isn't provided to Australians as of yet. And we're finding that the majority of people, whether it's Innisfail, we're in Mossman tonight, Kuranda, Tully, Logan City, Orange, Wagga, you name it, Bateman's Bay last week, we're finding that when we leave, people who are no or soft yes are more inclined to vote yes. And we always felt that if we could have those face-to-face conversations with Australians, cut out the politicians and cut out the media, that they would hear what we're saying as First Nations peoples, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, what we're saying when we issued that statement and why we think the voice is important.
Okay. In the Q&A box, the first question from Sue Lukes says, noting the different thresholds needed for the yes and no votes, how do we reconcile that with the percentage of population that are First Nation? It appears that the small percentage directly affected are being asked to meet the higher threshold. I can't comment on that. Can you, Dean?
Sorry. I'm not sure what reconcile means in this context. So I mean, Megan's carrying the load here, but I'm going to defer to her if I may.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think so. It's an important point. I suppose my point back, and people have made this point frequently on Twitter, is that in the gathering of each of the 13 dialogues, and certainly the one out at the Rock, and the decades of advocacy for constitutional recognition leading up to this point, is that our people are cognizant that to get the structural reform and to get the change, it does require a majority of Australians, and it is repugnant to some, but it is the reality of living in Australian democracy, where we have a rigid constitution that requires all Australians to agree. And I think people felt that it was important to do it because that's where the structural power kicks in, and because of the devastating impact that the repeal of legislation has had on people over the decades. But also because there was a large proportion of elders, so we're a gerontocracy, and the invitation list to all of the dialogues in Uluru were 60% elders and traditional owners, so the people who carry our kind of knowledge, our old people. Most of them either participated in or grew up under 67, and they really weren't. They have a different idea about changing the constitution than the majority, who are very cautious about it. So they felt very supremely confident that they could work with and persuade Australians to make the change because they'd done it once before. And you can see that kind of belief and faith in the Australian people and Australian agency imbued in the Uluru Statement. So while it's an important point that you make about those thresholds and that the small percentage directly affected are being asked to meet the higher threshold, because of the transformative impact of a constitutional voice will have on our affairs, because the change will be so profound, people felt like it was an important threshold to try and reach.
Okay. The next question from Emeritus Professor Christy Slade says, the panel has charted the high bar for success in the referendum. Megan charted the misinformation which is now dominating some media. Should those in favour of the voice put their arguments to the public differently or use different arguments? Megan?
I think it's a good question. I think today Linda Burney's speech was really good because I don't think it's being just talked about. So there's a misdiagnosis in my view that the vote is going downwards because the messaging isn't correct, when in fact the nature of the debate has been so lopsided, in that the no case, I mean, the no case always has an easier run, right? They just have to say no. But some of the really fanciful and over the top claims, such as this will destroy our democracy, that are just printed without any pushback or context and a lot of things in terms of fact checking. So there's one argument by Warren Mundine and Jacinta Price constantly that there were non-Indigenous people involved in the Uluru dialogues and at the Rock. That's just simply not true. It's not borne out at all. There was not a single non-Indigenous person involved other than 3 lawyers who were there to help me manage the questions. It's all on film. It's just simply not factual. But when you try to push back on it, media editors of newspapers and outlets, they just do not want to change what they're printing and publishing. The same as the Australian publishing a video of 3 APY leaders who were flown to Uluru by one of the senators, Senator Little, filmed out the front by the Australian and Sarah Ison, saying that their names they were surprised to see their names on the Uluru Statement, and the painting had been brought to the meeting and it was inappropriate. They weren't at the meeting and their names or signatures aren't on the painting. In fact, the painting is actually a really separate object to the Uluru process. What the elders gave us out at the Rock was a pity and a fighting stick. and some other objects that were given to Mark Liebler and Noel Pearson, but the painting was a kind of afterthought that was, you know, put together by somebody else. The whole video is full of misinformation, but again, they wouldn't take it down. So I think it's an important discussion going on now about, well, how do you run a referendum or a federal election if these kinds of claims are just allowed to be made without any fact checking or any pushback? So I think it's an important question about the arguments. You know, it's really, I mean, I don't profess to know media at all, but today Linda gave a speech at the press gallery that's being lauded by the media as being cut through, you know, a turning point for the campaigns. It's exactly what she's been saying, you know, for 8 months. And I've been saying to people today, I don't understand how these things work, because they're saying it's profound, and I'm like, she's been saying this over and over again. So your point about trying different arguments, I think, is really an important point. But it's interesting that they just gave a speech today, which was a great speech, but it's been received very differently. So who knows how these things work? But we certainly are. We've done a lot of focus groups, a lot of research. What we're hearing from Australians is, by and large, if you had the referendum last week or this weekend, it would win. It would be very tight. What we're seeing is very strong support from multicultural Australia, especially people from South Asia. So our Buddhist, Hindu, our Indian population, our Chinese population, very low, kind of mostly no in terms of Presbyterians, Anglicans, and Baptists. Yes for Catholics and Greek Orthodox. Kind of big no from baby boomers, but not all baby boomers. So baby boomers who are educated tend to be a yes. Baby boomers who are not educated tend to be a no. Most of Gen Z are a yes, but they tend to not turn up to the ballot box. So that's a problem. And so do our multicultural brothers and sisters. Millennials are a yes. My Gen X are kind of yes, but on the cusp of a no. They're kind of getting into that conservative age where you're trying to shore up your wealth and your mortgage and etc. And you know, they're questioning, good questions, but questioning a lot of this. And the silent, they call it a silent generation. So anyone under, I think 1940, 1945. So my mum, so she's 84. That kind of shows quite a substantive no, but then people like my mum and her U3A group are all yes. So it really does depend on where you are in the country too. So most of the states now, they track along the last election. They're all of the big cities are yes, but regionals are mixed.
Thank you very much, Megan. Look, you've got a question from Lisa and Jason Evans, which is related. And I'll read the question. We really enjoyed the information session. Professor Megan Davis is amazing. What can Yes supporters do from now till October to shift attitudes at a local level? Given the immense negativity we've already seen in social media, is a social media pushback one way forward?
So my advice, just based on the work that we're doing just in communities, is having those yarns face-to-face with local community people is the most effective. And there's 2 campaigns that can help with material if you need it, Yes 23, and then we're a bit more boutique with the Uluru Dialogue. So we're more we're running dialogues like we did at Uluru with Australians, and we're the kind of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kind of leaders who led that piece of work and have been pushing it for 6 years. So either groups you can get information from, but or do your own. But I'm finding that the most effective way of doing this is talking to Australians face to face. Social media, so Facebook is obviously where a lot of the debate is going on, because you can do so much clever geo-targeting with negative messages. But Twitter, most Australians aren't on it or look at it. It's mostly East Coast, and mostly particular cohorts. But Twitter does influence a lot of media because journalists can be really lazy, and use Twitter as a source for trends, etc. But yeah, there is especially a lot of negativity on Facebook. I know the 4 No campaigns, I know at least one of them spends $15,000 a day on Meta, which is Facebook and Instagram, and about a similar amount on Google per day in terms of disinformation. So it's definitely a money game in terms of that work. That's about $800,000 to $1 million per campaign to push that information out to Australians. So Facebook, unless, you know, certainly our campaign doesn't have that kind of money, but unless the Yes campaigns push back on that, then I think the only way of really having an impact on this is those Australians who support it exercising their civic agency to engage and talk to Aussies through the many different ways in which our societies function, sporting clubs, U3As, you know, community groups, all the kinds of things that make up the kind of wonderful, you know, makeup of who we are as Australians. But that would be my suggestion.
Well, okay. And the last question is from Professor Marie Gleeson. And she says, Megan, as a constitutional lawyer, what do you say to the risks of introducing a new chapter to the Constitution? Yeah,
so Marie, it's an important question because, of course, there's always unintended consequences of things, right? So Section 5126 in 1967, people thought was a marvellous change, but of course, the failure to amend it in a way that allowed for positive legislation for First Nations peoples meant that the consequence of Section 5126 is that the Commonwealth Parliament can make racially discriminatory laws against First Nations people. So single them out for adverse treatment. That's not applied to the broader population. And you've seen the Commonwealth exercise those powers in relation to Hindmarsh Island, the Northern Territory intervention, and in relation to WIC and the whittling down of native title to a bundle of rights. So people didn't expect that of 5126, but it is what it is. I think in relation to the voice, we worked for 6 years or 5 years, I suppose, across the political spectrum with people like Anne Toomey, George Williams, Brett Walker, and many others to settle on a reform that kind of met what we thought was the kind of legal and political limits of constitutional recognition for First Nations people. I'm not going to sit here and say that there's, you know, it's entirely foolproof because I don't know what it looks like on the other side. But I do agree with Brett Walker that a lot of the fanciful scenarios that are being put up as being legitimate are too silly for words, I think he said. I think that one of the biggest kind of complaints about the reform from First Nations is that they see it as weak because it is the capacity of First Nations peoples to issue representations to the Australian political system. But of course, those representations don't need to be responded to, which is the point that Chris made. And even though Chris made the point that those representations won't be made public, I'm pretty much 90% sure that the First Nations voice will always make those representations public because that's the leverage of this voice. Government doesn't have to respond. Government doesn't have to respond, but it provides us with the opportunity to make a representation and for that representation to be public, because right now that doesn't happen in the Australian political space. Most Australians are grappling with this reform because the Australian barometer that is issued by the Reconciliation Australia shows that the majority of Australians have never met an Aboriginal person. they've never met an Aboriginal person. And so that's partly why Australians are struggling with understanding the reform, because outside of meeting an Aboriginal person, the media does such a poor job in ventilating and analysing and scrutinising this area of public policy. So it's a profound reform in that we get to issue representations, and one of the key levers in this reform will actually be the media, the kind of informal regulator that it publishes that representation. And in Malcolm Turnbull's very powerful argument as to why he supports it now, and his third chamber argument, he says the very fact that this will be publicised on newspapers is why it's so powerful, is that governments get away, and Peter, you know this better than most, governments get away with absolute blue murder and poor policy in this space, and nobody blinks an eye because nobody knows about it. And the point that Turnbull was making was that, of course, governments don't want it. Of course, you know, Morrison, Littleproud, Abbott, Dutton don't want the world to know about those Australian National Audit Office reports that are just as bad as Bridget McKenzie, the reports about Bridget McKenzie and sports rorts. You know, but nobody, the media used to say to us, well, we're not going to run stories on it because Ken White's the first Aboriginal minister and we don't want to humiliate him. But for powerless, impecunious communities, often the media is all we have. And so the power to make representations, yes, it's true that the Commonwealth or the federal government can choose not to respond, but we say as Aboriginal people, we were told after the Gillard process that both sides of politics will not support a non-discrimination clause. So section 116A, a one-clause Bill of Rights, Abbott said. So we went back to the drawing board and we came up with a reform that we thought met the Australian legal and political temperament. And that is to say, a mandated role in laws and policies that are made about our people. So I think, Marie, that the risk of not doing this far outweighs the constitutional risk of enshrining a voice in the Parliament, of enshrining the voice to the Parliament and the Executive in the Constitution.
Okay, I have an apology to make. I was going to hand back to Susan Pond straight away, but Susan has let me know she's got a question, but it's in the chat box. So the question is, how well do the First Nations communities understand the implications of a yes or no vote?
I think they pretty much well understand the implications of either. I don't think they have any doubts about what a yes means and what a no means.
Okay. Back to you, Susan.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you to all the panelists. We all agree that the four speakers have provided detailed insights into the forthcoming referendum that will ask us to vote on the question, do you support an alteration to the Constitution that an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice should be enshrined? So I thank all our speakers who remind us exactly what is the voice, why it is being proposed, why we require a referendum, what the voice will and will not be able to do, what we don't know yet, the case for and against, and how the campaign may unfold from here. So on behalf of the audience and the Royal Society of New South Wales, I thank our speakers for dedicating their expertise and time to making us much better informed as we prepare as voters to enter the polling booth later this year. Thank you all and good evening.